Hello, and welcome to another Steer Your Career podcast. On the podcast coming up today, I got Casey Dai on, and Casey is a very thoughtful person who's been thoughtful about his career, has been very successful as a consultant at some large companies like Capgemini and Accenture. And now he is rethinking about how people learn and grow and what that means to our careers. He talks a lot about the different sort of decision-making processes as well, how it applies to our career. So I think you'll really enjoy this conversation between Casey and I. And if we can ever help you get a better job quickly, confidently, and with lots more money, that's what we do best at Academic Careers. So we help you with either personalized coaching, group coaching, or our suite of digital courses. So however you like to learn, however you want to be helped to empower you to accelerate your career, we're here to help. Just head to kadima.careers.com, Kadima careers.com. And the last three words I'll leave you with before we head into this episode are own your career. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Steer Your Career podcast. Today, I am really excited to have Casey Dai on the podcast because I met Casey like I meet most people on LinkedIn. I really should get out more. But what I really appreciate about Casey, he was referred from someone else that I follow on LinkedIn, Jordan Cutler. And when I got to know Casey, I was really impressed with how thoughtful he is about being conscientious about one's career. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Casey. Casey, share a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, let me do a quick timeline. I usually cover my background like an iceberg model. So I'll go through like the tip of the iceberg, what most people see, and then there's like a whole bunch of stuff underneath. Okay, so quick chronology. I grew up around family of entrepreneurs, and then naturally that led me to business school. Did finance a couple years before transitioning over to tech, specifically in data analytics. So went back to school, got my master's, and then landed at Accenture in their AI and analytics practice. Did that for a few years, started to lead projects, and then moved over to one of our clients at Manulife to lead a data engineering team. And I found that first transition to be kind of indicative of a lot of things to follow, which is, I'd say, the first time I really zoomed out and thought about my career strategically. What I found in my experience in data science was the bottleneck commonly landed on data engineering. And I wanted to check two boxes within a 3-5 year timeframe. One is to figure out how to solve data engineering problems as a means of doing better data science, and to take on a leadership role rather than manage things at an engagement project level, as you tend to do in consulting. Really nurture a team, do hiring, people development over the long haul. So went to Manulife, scaled a team from about 5 to roughly 30 when I left over a 2.5 year span. Shipped a lot of machine learning models to production during that time, working with our data science practice. Then a senior leadership role came up at Capgemini, so I decided to go back to consulting. So that was my transition from leading to more market facing and selling. If I were to distill that down to one point, it would be, instead of thinking about how do you fulfill the requests that come in as the projects, you have to really think about, can you anticipate demand and highlight problems that clients may not think they have? They are hidden underneath, right? So that was like probably the biggest mindset shift from leading a large team to selling plus handling large parts of the project delivery as well. All of that, like in about 10 years, last July, I decided to quit corporate and run Expanded Skills. We're a training provider and explored a couple like areas, and I can talk a bit about more of those. But the current direction right now is we focus on helping people make sharper decisions while faced with various forms of career uncertainty. Yeah, so that's the nutshell. Behind the scenes, beneath the iceberg, there's a lot of things that went into the transition. My wife quit last September as well from her corporate job. So we're running a local renovation business here in Toronto. So we have two businesses that are polar opposites. So the context switch is quite challenging, but quite fun. So Expanded Skills is global reach, all online basically. And the company my wife and I run, York Reno, it's a windows and doors renovation company, pure residential homes in Toronto.
There's such disparate industries, and it's a really good way to mitigate risk as you're both entrepreneurs and in two very different
Absolutely.
areas, and probably leveraging a lot of the skills for sales, marketing, operations, customer success, and so forth.
Yeah. Yep. Partnerships, hiring, those are all very ubiquitous skills in addition to all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So early in your introduction, you said naturally it led to business school. Do you think that paths naturally lead to business school now? And why did you choose to go to
Mm.
business school? And how do you think other people should think about? I don't know if it's as natural of a decision to go to business school
Oh,
for
probably not.
everybody.
To me, it felt natural, but now that I think back, I had to fight tooth and nail with mostly my parents who wanted me to take a medical doctor path or a lawyer and all that. I think if I didn't really press what I wanted to do, I probably would have taken one of those paths because I had the academic rigor for it and your brain works analytically. So you tend to be able to conquer those domains, but just didn't find those problems at its core that compelling to me. And it's natural because my parents are all entrepreneurs. I'm actually the first person in about 3 generations in my family that didn't start in entrepreneurship from day one. So yeah,
Wow.
there's some fighting definitely going on behind the scenes to embark on the path. Yeah.
How much of what you learned in the MBA was required or needed or helped you in your path forward?
Not much. And more surprisingly so in my master's of analytics, being more technical, that I think capped out at about 5% I used within the first 5 years of graduating. And then now I don't think I use much of it at all. You just update all your mental models, all your toolkit, everything. Business school, I think even less so, doesn't give you enough exercises where you're directly interacting with the market. And Alan, as the market is chaotic and ruthless and is not afraid to tell you where your inadequacies are, which I think business school keeps you in a nice shelter and reinforces certain behaviors like over planning and not chipping enough or just not interacting with customers, which are to be fair, difficult exercises to simulate within a school environment, which we can cover a bit later about what I think is lacking in traditional education, which is actually the underlying DNA for how I approach the topics I tackle as part of expanded skills. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's do the MBA thing
Yeah.
first. Just one other question on that. And then I do want to hear how your past education has informed what you're doing with expanded skills. I don't think MBAs are all that worth it either. I think what's worth it for an MBA is the brand name recognition. So if you can pay to get a good brand name logo on there, which comes with an alumni base, but more with the credibility or the authority to open doors for you. So I spent a shit ton of money for my MBA, $138,000. I learned a couple of things in the classroom that I still recall and remember, but I could have gotten that also from reading books.
Mm-hmm.
Or now YouTube videos. But what I got from it is the ability for American Express to hire me because they looked at Columbia Business School as a school they're hiring from. And then when I went to Google, they're like, oh, when they introduced me in the org announcement, they're like, oh, Alan came from American Express and Columbia Business School. They did not say that about Binghamton University, where I went undergrad. So I think that's what you're actually paying for. I think the network there is good. The opportunities are good because opportunities come to those magnet brands. But I don't think the MBA is all that worth it either.
Yeah, I think it's trending downward more and more. So this is actually one of the core aspects of what makes traditional education suck from K to 12 to postgrad. It's because the next step is you need to enter the workforce. And as long as the hiring is based on proxies of competence and things that have signaling value, such as a brand name school or a degree and so forth, it'll continue to be perpetuated. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. So what's happening even at grade school level is the educator is placed in a position where they can gatekeep essentially the grade and the cert. And as long as the next step of what comes after for hiring cares about those two things, then the student is obligated to sit through a lecture, no matter how dry, no matter how poor the delivery, and even in some cases, no matter how expensive. But as if the hiring is more instead of a proxy for actually what you need them to do, which I understand is for practicality, especially if you're hiring at scale, is necessary. It's more towards, can you actually do the actual task, right, that you need them to do? And the more the interview processes and the screening before that step mirrors like what you actually need them to do and less on signals, then I see some changes upstream to that as well. So I think that's one of the cornerstones after thinking many hours about just what makes traditional education not great.
Yeah, totally agree. And I have kids now that I don't think had a particularly good high school education, but they were trained to do well on APs and the SATs. And that got them into good schools. My boys are going to great schools that, frankly, give them a very good brand name recognition that will open doors for them. I think they'll learn stuff. And I think the social aspect is very valuable. But on the education, on the technical skills, I think there's probably there's many more efficient ways to deliver that to individuals.
Yeah, I think the whole topic of learning to learn and what makes something easy to learn and what makes sense to learn more theory versus you have to do practice comes down to two things. One is if it's an ill-structured domain. So what that means is the problems don't arise in a predictable way. And once you arise it, you don't know the problem is there, right? So in business, it's like highly ill-structured because you don't know when you need to apply the Porter 5 forces, right? Even though that's like a prescription to certain problems and symptoms that come up, right? You don't know when you need to rebuild your customer personas and all that. You can learn like as much theory as possible on the prescription side, but the way the problems manifest is highly chaotic and random and uncertain. While for other professions like that are more procedural, that there's a label for the problem and the prescription is like more or less a 1-for-1 mapping to the label. I don't want to like oversimplify medicine, but if you have a certain condition post diagnosis, then the prescription afterward is relatively linear. Same with accounting. So like once your books are closed for the year, the transactions contained within that year are static, right? They're not moving around. And there are like rules and policies for how to like record and report on those like transactions themselves. So those domains, like it makes a lot more sense to spend a lot of time on the theory of the prescription because the problems, how they manifest, and when you know you're in a particular situation is relatively predictable. They're well-structured domains versus ill-structured. The second thing that makes a domain hard to conquer is whether it's a kind domain or a wicked domain. So the wicked domain essentially is the feedback loop is not clear on whether you did a good job or not. So let's use the tech space to illustrate this. So when you're an IC, that domain and what you're required to do to push code every day is very kind because you can almost test instantaneously whether your code works and it's going to break something else or cause like bugs to appear, right? Or whether like you actually debugged something. But if you move to more leadership levels, like if you make a decision to say migrate from platform A to B, that feedback loop is very noisy and delayed. You don't know even perhaps for 2 years, 5 years later, whether that is a good decision or not. So next time you make the decision to migrate a platform, you actually don't know what you did right or wrong when you did it the first time. So it's like the combination of those two factors together actually just dictate like how hard a domain is to learn and how relevant like theory and like more academics and like technical training is.
Did you come up with these concepts like well-structured versus ill-structured and the other dimension?
They're like quite hard to dig up, but if to like search for those terms, there are like some academic research and some people with like really deep ideas on this, but it's far from mainstream.
And it's thinking about what is going to be replaced by AI.
Yes.
These well-structured challenges will be replaced by AI. Like the example that you used about diagnosing diseases, that can be done better. If we have the right diagnostics, you know what the treatment should be.
Yep.
And putting humans in there to decide something is almost negative because they may go with emotion or they may go with something else besides the data. But like the business decisions, and not just business decisions, but very complex decisions that have lots of different variables, that have lots of different interdependency. Maybe they could eventually be known and be optimized by some decision matrix, but it's just so vast of different variables.
I foresee even 10 years from now, given how Gen AI accelerated everything, like you said, most of the high paying roles are either going to be tweaking those parameters itself for like how the AI or the machine makes the decisions, or it's going to be like defining problems to point these systems to that are worth solving. They're not good at actually problem definition or even rejecting a problem to say, this is not worth solving and it's at a greater opportunity cost. You should solve this instead. Or sequencing problems in a way that if I solve this one thing, I don't need to worry about these 10 problems, right? Which goes back to, I think, another core piece. If I were to only pick like another thing, what's wrong with traditional education is we're overtrained to answer the question once it's already set and the answer is set, basically. You're trying to pattern match to what the pre-populated answer is. And your academic performance is directly indicative of that, right? In the real world, especially in entrepreneurship and more of the chaotic, volatile domains, which I tend to help people with now, is most of the value is picking the right question to solve and like structuring the question in a way that whatever response you produce is going to be like intelligent. So prompt engineering is an indicator of where this is going, but this existed for a long time. A lot of like leadership is about like, how do I come up with the right prompt? So people are working towards a direction and you're nudging them to like, look at this instead of looking at that thing, right? Rather than coming up with the entire answer yourself. Because it's like school conditions us to think there's one question and there's one solution. It's like a very one for one mapping. In reality, it's more like a many for many. So there could be multiple questions that could be answered, right? At any one point in time, you have to choose. And a solution or a concept can apply to many different questions. So there's two highly undertrained muscles. One is your ability to come up with intelligent questions. The second is lateral thinking. When you figured out a solution, you don't ask, it's like, where else I could apply this, right? Or can I apply this across disciplines? That's actually the cornerstone for like where I think the education gap is. And people are just not getting enough reps because the system's just not designed that way.
Yeah, I don't think we're often taught to think. So say we do get to this space, and I love prompt engineering. And this is my layman's perception of prompt engineering, being able to effectively articulate a question or command so that the AI will do what you ask it to do.
Yep.
Like you just have to ask effective questions or give clear instructions. It's communication. If you're a good communicator, you should be able to be a good prompt engineer.
Yeah, even a content creator. The underlying secret to nonfiction content creation is, can you come up with the prompts and then answer your own prompt? And then in the end, you could just remove the question and replace it with a headline, or you could keep the question in. Almost all nonfiction content on the internet is a form of answering a prompt. How do I do this? Why does this work that way? Right? Even though the title may not be suggestive of, that's actually how you generate content. So if you're able to come up with intelligent prompts for what your audience and readers might want to hear about and then answer them in a compelling way, that's basically all nonfiction. Yeah. So everything kind of converges on just, can you come up with an intelligent prompt? And can you nudge it in a way, like in a series of follow-up prompts that you can go deeper on a subject or draw connections between concepts that may not be apparent?
I have two different ways we can go here, and you tell me. One is with the poor process of education. You're doing something with expanded skills and what you're doing there. The other topic that's interesting is, okay, with AI, with the ability to eliminate a lot of work for what you're calling the well-structured problems like doctors, lawyers, accounting, things like that. Those tasks will go away. And there will be less people that need to supervise a wide swath of those tasks. So what happens to all those people that are losing jobs across all these industries? So we can go either way.
Let's tackle two first, because that's actually easier, and then we'll go back to one. So I think it's like those are just more clear examples where parts of their workflow have actually things in there that it's better taken care of with software. So we go back to the prescription diagnosis to prescription example. That's essentially an if-then condition underneath. Or in accounting, I'm trying to like decide which policy to apply for this. You're essentially doing a lookup of some sorts, right? So anything that you can model using a software flow that's like an if-then or a lookup, some kind of conditional, then those should be automated. And then the jobs will shift towards coming up with those if-then conditions in the first place, and then modifying and refining them over time. And also defining like what problem that set of like conditions is solving in the first place.
But you need as many people to come up with those ideas because you had a lot of worker bees.
Yeah,
but you need that many idea generators.
No, you don't.
There's much fewer idea generators. So what happens to those people?
Oh, there's no way to answer this without going back to the education piece. Because I think if we look at what the education system's optimized to churn out, It's people implementing processes and procedures that are already defined. So
It
there
was,
might be
it
an
was your fault.
upstream
It was
change
your fault.
needed that if you get kids to examine questions to say, is this a worthwhile question? Is this question asked intelligently? And you need to come up with a more intelligent question instead of answering the exam questions as is, then like you'll train more people to be more fit towards those roles that are like defining problems or like looking at things from a more strategic lens. I think they're just like the talent distribution is heavily skewed towards that sector where you're like implementing things that overlap with AI workflows. But it's like the change really needs to happen like earlier on. So are people equipped to take on tasks that don't overlap with those workflows and like really synergize to enable those workflows to do more?
So I like how you're going there. And what I think needs to occur is
Yeah.
retraining for people, re-education for the sort of tasks that are not like well structured and automated. So things like teaching, things like healthcare, things like mental health care. I don't see a time where you can some of the emotive support, some service, like paying people for public service of some parks and recreation and things of that activity. The fact that some classrooms have 30 students per one teacher, and my kids go to a school where there's 11 kids per one teacher, there is a disproportionate higher likelihood of my kid's success than those people in the 30-to-1 ratio. And you can't automate that with AI, as far as I know. I still think you do need that human interaction with a 7-to-1 ratio or a 10-to-1 ratio rather than a 30-to-1 ratio.
It's like the people who win is like your AI plus knowledge worker, and you know how to tap into that and zooming out to design your skill sets strategically around it rather than being upset about things that are happening.
It's knowledge worker and I think emotional
Yes.
support too, because I think that is hard to replicate with any sort of well structured, like with AI.
Yeah.
I think that emotional support is needed in a lot of areas that is lacking.
I think that segues perfectly into if I deep dive where I'm taking expanded skills. So yeah, the one liner earlier was decision making under uncertainty to deal with things that happen in your career over a long time horizon, right? But how it landed on this was the initial prompt was if I look at high performers across like a 40-year career span, what kind of skill sets would I put in that person's skills if I'm optimizing for 40 years, right? That's how it started. So if I bracket up the skills into, there's a lot of tactical skills if you're optimizing for under 6 months for you to get the biggest boost. For example, let's say there's a technical skill gap on your resume and you need to do a piece of work that you're assigned or for you to land your next job, right? So there's like tactical within 6 to 12 months. Then if we look at like within 5 years, I would put something like sales closer to the top, ability to influence people, ability to build relationships and all that. So there's like that tier. But then if you're trying to optimize for anything beyond 5 years, there's really only two things that stick out. One is your ability to think, so learning to think, critical reasoning. And the second is your learning to learn. And the sequencing between those two is super interesting. I actually think you can't really effectively learn to learn if you don't learn to think, because then your filters are completely broken. So that was like, yeah, the thesis that came up with late 2023 that like made me hit the reset button for expanded skills. Because it's like, well, if I look at those two spaces, which one has the biggest supply demand gap? It's definitely the critical reasoning space. Because I think the problem is growing because topics like media literacy, being able to think independently for yourself, dopamine detox from social platforms, all that stuff is just impairing our ability, especially the slow thinking brain, and to deliberately reason out something complex. The accelerated learning space is not in great shape, but I'd say it's like the coverage there is slightly better. Critical thinking space. And then if that critical thinking, we go down a layer more, then it just mostly just comes down to decision making tools. And if we look at the landscape out there, if I wanted to pick up a good critical reasoning, decision making like training, can I do that? Right. So if you type in decision making training in Google, you get 1.2 billion results, somewhere between 1 billion to 1.2 billion results. So it's like going through it. And what I noticed is just it's not approached in a way that I think makes people a good decision maker, especially over the long term. I look at like decision making, especially in ill-structured, wicked domains, as going to the gym. An example is if you read about these 5 cognitive biases and you're aware of them. You're not immune to them the next day, right? Nor is that like the right way to actually optimize your decision making. A lot of it is you understand the concept, so the prescription, but do you have the reps to notice when that problem manifests, like the trigger event? So it's more like you're looking for a mental gym to train your decision making and have someone let you know that, hey, there's these things out there that you can make a mistake. And here's how you build a heuristic. Here's like when you need a mental shortcut, or here's like when you really need to slow down. And the first decision you make within the first 20 seconds is never the optimal one. There's just a lack of that stuff in general. So I was thinking, okay, expand skills is always the school I always wanted for myself. So then it's, okay, let's just build this toolkit in a way that I think there's a gap on the market over. Because we're to break it down, like why there's a gap. It's usually a dry academic delivery. It's here's a bunch of theory without tying to the practical scenarios ahead of time. So then you end up with 95% too much theory. Because if there's a forcing function to map each theory to a practical scenario that people struggle with and will likely encounter, then I'd say the textbooks are like 95% thinner, which is why it feels bad, right? Because you have to memorize all this theory because they're not actually tied to the practical scenarios. But if we work the other way around, it's here's a very practical scenario, and then we figure out what theory is relevant to solving it. Then it just cuts it down. A lot of the things from institutions, I think, are like priced in a way that's too expensive and just not accessible unless you're tapping into a corporate budget, because it's usually 2 to 5 day workshops at anywhere between $3,000 to $10,000, which I think is, one is it doesn't solve the problem. You can't watch 2 days of presentations to optimize decision making. The second thing is it's not delivered in a compelling way. Yeah, I also mentioned, it's like the lack of practice embedded within it. It's like someone lecturing you the whole time, which is another carryover effect from what makes traditional education suck. It's very like administration driven for the curriculum. It's not student driven or like customer driven, right? When we talk about customer centricity for other businesses, then it should definitely be like student driven. It's not, here's a bunch of theory that I don't care about while I have a pressing problem in my head. It's let us know what your pressing problem is and we'll point you to the right tools and exercises so you could get better and solve it. So that's the gist of it, right? It's like the topic is informed by how do you become a badass over 40 years? And then the delivery is informed by like the inverse of what sucks with traditional education.
And so how do people experience this? Is this a curriculum? Is it like, is it a book?
It's a training platform. I'm going through a beta launch pretty soon. Let's call it Systems for Sharper Decisions. Basically, it's boiled down to here's about 2 to 3 important, but like foundational skills you need. So what that looks like is how do you consume information is like the first thing. Then the second thing is how do you build a heuristic, or when does it make sense to implement a mental shortcut? So for your decisions that are under 20 seconds, right? And then the third is do you have a good process to reason through and deliberately think through the critical decisions, which are like the 1-2% that can change the trajectory of your career. Then afterwards, it's all the practical scenarios where you're going to apply that toolkit, starting with the low-hanging fruit, easy wins. I'll give you an example of, so in my community, we talk a bit about personal finance. That's an area where like decision making on using mental shortcuts helps a lot. Where a lot of things is like you need to think hard about what rule you set, but once you set the rule, you don't have to touch it for a long time, nor should you touch it. Yep. So that's an example of a domain where like the heuristics part of the fundamentals will apply.
Like Ramit Sethi, I think we might have chatted about him before, but what he's done there in terms of just telling you, this is what you do. This is the algorithm of how to get rich.
Yeah, we actually reviewed one of Ramit's talks in my community a few weeks ago. Yeah, the fundamentals are there. I think it's like most people make decisions subconsciously, which gets them into a lot of trouble personal finance wise. But a lot of things you just need to work out the mental model one time and then just stick to it, right? Like for every $100 of income you get, what is your rough distribution between these 4 buckets? Usually it's the 2 spending buckets is like essentials and discretionary. And then you have like short-term liquidity and then long-term investments, basically, right? So if there's like a certain allocation you stick with that you don't have to update even annually, maybe it's only after a major life event that like you update it, like your kids are off to college and you're empty nester, then that's an inflection point that you may want to rebuild that mental model, or your pay goes up like 3x overnight, right? Then you don't have a short-term liquidity problem because you're like emergency funds for 6 months or however long runway you want is not going to be a relevant thing. So it's all about building wealth in the long term, right? So I think it's like decision-making education. I wish it's like those scenarios are worked out first. and then looking at like where people make poor decisions, and then layer in a little bit of theory and concepts for them to solve those things eventually on their own.
So this is a great idea. Who is your customer?
Oh, people who inherently have a lot of volatility in their jobs. So there are 5 personas. One is people in tech, because tech, it's inherently chaotic, and the only constant is change, and then change is a catalyst for uncertainty. Consulting, it's a bit hidden, but as a consultant, you're constantly parachuted into clients' environments where you have little context, but they actually expect you to be a step ahead of the curve. So that causes a lot of change and volatility and for you to be on your toes. Salespeople, obviously, because they're just constantly chasing a target, and there's a lot of variance in the sales cycle, and like your mental toughness and being able to stay resilient during a downturn is important. 4th is like anyone in finance moving money around. Basically, that includes not just people on Wall Street, but if people play poker professionally and all that, right? Your whole job is to manage the volatility and make like sharp decisions, right? Constantly. And of course, the holy grail is entrepreneurship, because it has elements of all 4. You're moving your resources around, you're dealing with changes in the market. Clients expect you to be a step ahead of the time. And of course, sales is in the equation.
So these 5 persona, how is it delivered? How are these skills delivered to them? And what results are they expected to receive?
Yeah. One thing I don't train on like the 101 technical for their domain, right? So for tech is like, usually my client base is like relatively senior, that they already know what to do like foundationally. It's more as they move up, they're dealing with like more and more variance, right? And what mental models do you need to build to perform on your job? Not just I have a high and then my performance like wavers. It's more like with these models, you're like more consistently performing, or you're like better positioned that today you work in sales, you have the skill sets that if you moved over to finance, you'd be okay in 6 months. It's really optimizing for that. I think the people who resonate with my content, it's not necessarily what job title they have. It's more like, do they like analytically working through things? Do they think long term? Do they want to optimize for the long term? Are they generally like thoughtful? Right? Do they care about like practical application, but is not afraid to learn theory as long as it ties to practice? So there's like those things that like it's a better fit for, and they'll enjoy the delivery of the materials more. But I think if we're to like look at the ICP on a job title basis, it's just people who naturally have uncertainty built into their job.
How is it delivered? Is it like a course?
So part course, part group coaching model, right? So there's content that I need them to build. It's just like the 101 skills we covered before, and then I'll build scenarios, but then I'll train them through, or like coach them through how to navigate each of these situations. And they can bring their own scenarios, and the library grows over time.
Really cool. And what's your long-term goal with expanded skills?
I just hope to stick with the core premise, which is even if I wasn't doing this as a business, it's like a really cool thing for myself. So it's like an audience of one is the thing. And then I think it goes back to the 2 prompts that I look at every morning, which is how do I stay competitive across a 40-year time horizon? And how can I fix what sucks about traditional education? So my goal is actually just to, regardless of how it scales and grows, to just stick with solving these 2 prompts. And of course, building something that's vetted and like useful for myself as well.
That's great. It's good to have that personal vision and those 2 prompts to start your day.
Yeah,
I like that.
It took a lot of distilling.
And it's all about asking the right questions. So we're running low on time, Casey. So I have 2 last questions for you. 1, what is one piece of sick career advice that you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
Yeah, other than the ask better questions, which we covered earlier, I would say let your curiosity drive things, because that's usually the lead domino to results. So it's usually curiosity leads to a healthy form of obsession and your ability to dig deeper into the domain and uncover things other people don't. And then that kind of builds your edge over time. And don't let your curiosity be constrained to domains. As in, if you have an interest in biology, then by all means, go learn like the 101 in biology. Because what happens is there's a lot of stuff, even in the 101s of these domains, that are applicable across other things. So for example, systems thinking has been around for a long time, right? But systems thinking in the context of management and leadership in like large companies and all that, the bridge isn't always drawn. right? So there's like concepts in systems thinking that helps you identify like worthwhile projects for your team to do. But you don't like follow your intellectual curiosity and just explore those things, then like those concepts are contained within the silos and they don't permeate. Because what happens is I covered this on a talk I gave community 2 weeks ago, which is these domains are logically separated, not by reflecting how reality works. They're separated with a different purpose, which is to make them like manageable so like people can study a certain domain and to prevent like territory battles, right? Almost like in an academic setting. But reality actually doesn't care about how you cut up physics versus biology versus chemistry versus math. Like it's all just one big system interacting with each other, right? So if you're solving problems that are correlated to reality, you should not respect how these domains are divided up.
Okay. So I like that. Follow your
Yeah.
curiosity, and that will create self motivation. And there's a lot of
Yeah.
interconnectedness. Cool. And then finally, how can people learn more from you, find you, follow you, help you out?
Yeah. Just head over to expandedskills.com/community. That's the best way to hang out with myself. I give a talk live once a week where we find a discussion worthy topic and content and we review it as a group. I think that's the best way to see how my thoughts unfold in public and how I make decisions real time as well.
That's great. Awesome, Casey. Well, really great chatting with you. I'm glad that our paths have crossed thanks to the power of LinkedIn and the interwebs. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan.
Appreciate
Yep.
you.